So how many of you would believe that the history of oil products come from not so much oil products? They're oil products, but not as we see them, as like lubricating substances for moving parts inside an engine. A lot of the technology that came to the automotive field came from detergent makers, candle and soap makers, Procter and Gamble. Each one of them had their own niche and eventually ended up spanning off into lubricants. You could go as far as the early to mid 1800s and see that people used oil to make candles and soap. If you look at the refining process of crude oil, you would look at crude oil that's mined, it's being brought into a big giant vat, and that's boiled basically. And along that vat, there's different pipes, and as different vapors and byproduct of that boiled crude oil move throughout that system, those pipes take that weighted substance that gets to certain levels off to other areas. And all the way at the top, you have your natural gases. Somewhere closer to the bottom is where you get your oil product that is then in turn refined into something more, filtered more and more. A lot of people ask me questions about the types of oils that go in their vehicles. But before I get into the question answering portion, I want to talk a little bit about how manufacturers come up with a weighted specific type oil. 5W20 and 5W30 almost lay on top of each other when it comes to a temperature spectrum and lubricity and how they perform inside an engine. You could take different 0W categories that lay on top of each other as well, is what I meant. And the smaller the number is in a winter form, the thinner the oil acts in a cold climate. And the second part of the number on the other side of the W is what it acts like at operating temperature. Now, people often say, well, down here in Texas or down here in Florida, a 20W50 oil would be better. No, your engine is only going to operate, maybe a little bit, you're right. But your engine's always going to be much hotter in an overall atmospheric standpoint than what your temperature is in your state. Yeah, you might gain a few degrees because you're in a hotter climated area, so you might need a thicker oil, but it's very minute. So somebody that tells me they're taking 20W50 and they're putting it in a vehicle where it's a 5W20 recommended is ludicrous to me. There's nowhere in the United States that would negate for a 20W50 to go into an engine that has a 5W20 or 5W30 rating, unless it was a race car engine. Now, race car engines are built very loose, so that thicker oil is going to be able to move to those parts faster and lubricate those parts faster because that's what it's designed for. That's what it operates the best at. When you look at the tolerances in main bearings and rod bearings in your conventional vehicles that are not race engines, they're very tight tolerances. And the tighter they get, the lower viscosity is needed to lubricate those engines. So something that's a 20W50 being put into a motor that's a 0W20 or a 5W20, you're taking such a heavy weight that's built as a viscosity 20 and operating it in a vehicle that was designed for something 15 on cold start, because they need to get that oil from the pan into the pump, through the filter, from the filter. Maybe there's a regulator on the other side. Maybe the regulator's built into the pump area, but then it has to go into the main bearing crank area, and then it goes from there elsewhere, right? Those moving parts have to get lubricated immediately. Well, if you run a 20W50 motor oil in a motor that's designed for 5W20, it takes substantially longer for you to get that oil to those locations where it belongs. So people that tell me, oh, I run 20W50, my engine's so quiet, or yeah, it probably is a lot quieter. But there's a lot of stuff that you're actually negating in the process of doing that. One of the things is your heat transferability. You take a heavy oil and expect to to reduce the heat on a component that's not designed for it. Heavy oil doesn't pull heat out of a substance right away. Heavy oil being run across the surface doesn't move as fast as a lighter oil in a tighter tolerance engine. So if you look at one of my previous videos where I showed you what oil does on the underside of a piston skirt on a 1.5 liter EcoBoost engine, you could see the one side where the oil's spraying up at the bottom of it from the jet, and it's hitting the bottom of that piston, and it's real nice and super clean. But the other side that doesn't get any oil splashed on it, it's varnished, it's tarnished, it has sludge buildup and stuff on it, it's browned all over the place. Why is that? Because that oil has chemical additives in it that reduce oxidation, that prevent oxidation, that prevent rusting, varnishing, tarnishing, those kinds of things. So that oil is only getting sprayed on one side of that piston, but there's also a turn to that as well. With that oil only getting jetted on that one side of the piston, it's actually pulling heat out of it as well. So that thin oil that's getting sprayed up on the bottom of that, and it's pulling heat out, it's reducing the wear and stuff on that one side. But what about the other side? The other side's not getting hit with any oil. It's all tarnished and varnished and looks terrible. Well, it's not getting that chemical additive that's in the oil sprayed on that side of the piston. So you see one side's nice and super clean. It's always getting heat reduced and pulled out of it, right? The other side's not. It has to slowly dissipate heat because it's not getting that thin oil sprayed on it. A thicker oil. Now, say if we put a thicker oil in that engine, do you think that thicker oil would reduce the heat on the bottom side of that piston the same as a thin oil would? No. A thin oil is transferring faster and it's moving. A thicker oil is going to take longer for it to get there to begin with. And then it's going to take longer for it to drip off of it back down into the crank area so new stuff could always be recirculated there. So a thicker oil and an engine that's not designed for it might make it a little quieter because it's taking up and it's creating more pressure in certain areas, but it's not making that engine run any more efficient. Once you get to a point where you have to dump a heavier oil into a motor to get it to be quiet, it's a Band-Aid. And you're actually causing more damage in the long run because of all of the elongated starts for the oil to get where it needs to go. See, how they figure out tolerances is they take the surface of like a rod bearing and they times it by point, or like say like a rod journal. So it'd be like 2.028 times 0.0001. And you might come out like, 2.085 times 0.001 per square inch, or whatever it's measured in square inches or square, I think it's a square inch. It's not square thousandths of an inch or hundredths of an inch. It's a square inch. And they take that tolerance by that rod bearing and that main journal, and they figure out where do I need to be in a category. So if my numbers come out like 0.021, I know by chart value that I should be around a 5W20, 5W30. I know if I start getting higher up in that spectrum to like I don't know if it's like 0.030 or 0.031, then now my numbers are up over like a 5W30, pushing more towards like a 30 weight or something like that, or a 20W50. Maybe I've got even a looser engine and I need like a 20W50 or a 50 weight oil overall. There's a difference here. 50 weight oils are at the highest part of the spectrum, right? There is no motor, no regular car motor, that the average daily non-high performance vehicle that would run a 50 weight oil. There's nothing on the road. And if you're telling me that you're running a 20W50 in a 4.6 liter 2 valve that has a 2.080 rod journal clearance, I'm going to tell you you're nuts. There's no reason for that. You're reducing your fuel efficiency, you're reducing your motor function, your motor efficiency, you're creating more friction inside that motor having to move that heavier weight of oil around. Now, if you would have told me that back in 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, when we had the really loose 5-liter engines that did really good with a 30-weight oil because they were super loose motors, right? Those motors, you could beat the living hell out of them and they would keep going and going and going. So you could go to a 30-weight oil and run it all the time. And it did fine, but that was a really loose motor. The motors after like the early 90s started getting pretty tight overall, and the new EcoBoost engines and stuff now, the newer high horsepower engines that we're getting from the factory, that's why we're starting to see closer to zero numbers, because those tolerances are tighter now. So when you get to an engine that's creating a lot of heat, it has a lot of boosted application to it, it's a lot of moving parts, more parts now than ever, you need an oil that can get in and out of there very, very quickly. That's why these manufacturers are choosing zero-weight oils and stuff now. That's why they're using a 0W20, 0W15, 0W16 or something like that I seen the other day. I use, in my vehicle, a 5W20 oil. I use what the manufacturer recommends. Now, is a conventional oil good? Yes, it is. But when conventional oils are manufactured, they are manufactured not the cleanest. Conventional oils are fine, but there are some contaminants in there that don't get filtered out. And when you go to a semi-synthetic oil, a semi-synthetic oil has a little bit of synthetic property and a little bit of conventional property. So it's got a little bit of both worlds to it, right? You still get a little contamination, but not as much as conventional oil. But then when you go to a full synthetic oil, all that contamination is removed out of there. Sometimes they put better additives in it. And synthetic oil in general is a better product. The molecules are all the same size. There's no contamination in there. And certain synthetics are made different than other synthetics. Now, a lot of people say synthetic oil is completely man-made, and that's a lie. It's not. It actually spans from crude oil. It's how it's refined to get there. And when you actually look at like Pennzoil synthetic, where they use the natural gas through a scientific reaction of adding like hydrocarbons and stuff like that to create their synthetic oil, it's a very pure, clean product. Now, I could go into the history. This is the first video of answering questions. The second video is going to be about the history of oil itself. And it's going to be about how a lot of our big manufacturing companies today are the reason why we have the oils that we have, even though they may not be directly correlated to engine oil. Like Procter & Gamble, candle wax soap maker, has to come from somewhere. And they were some of the first people that started playing with oil to get their products to where they wanted. That's coming next. This is to get the questions out there. Now, people ask me, is synthetic better than conventional? Yes, it is. Does it last longer? Yes, it does. Is it absolutely necessary in a brand new vehicle? If it's under warranty and the manufacturer recommends that and they find out you're not putting that in there and all they have to do is send off an oil sample, yes, put it in there. Should you run a full synthetic from brand new? Is it okay? Sure. It's a great oil. It's a great product. It's better than conventional. It's better than semi-synthetic. Now, is it all it's cut out to be? It's hard to say. Should you change your oil? What I mean by it's hard to say is, okay, so if you use conventional oil and you change your oil often, every 2,500 miles, every 3,000 miles, you're probably never going to see a problem. It's completely fine. Now, if you're wanting to wait that 5,000, 7,500 mile range before you change your oil, yeah, a full synthetic is going to be hands down the way to go. And I don't even recommend that. I hate the manufacturer's oil change level. I hate the fact that they say that some of these cars can go 10,000 miles. That is absolutely ludicrous to me. It's the biggest hogwash I've ever heard in my entire life. The more you change your oil, the more that oil stays fresh, the more those chemical compounds, those dispersants, the the agitating agents, the suspension agents, the antioxidants that are in there and stuff, the anti-foaming agents that are in that oil, that stay fresh and newer, the better off your engine is going to be. So waiting 5,000 miles to change your oil, it's probably one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever seen a manufacturer say is okay, but they allow the customer to do it. And some of these like EcoBoost engines, when I get them in the shop and I'm ripping apart these engines and rebuilding them, I'm looking in the pan and they only got 50, 60,000 miles and there's already sludge starting to build up. It's because they're letting these people drive these vehicles on these oil changes so long, the chemical compound inside the oil is starting to break down and it's not preventing the sludge anymore. So if you ask me what oil I prefer to use a full synthetic. I prefer to use a manufacturer filter or a high-end filter, not a cheap filter. A lot of the cheap filters don't have anti-feedback diaphragms, so a lot of the oil kind of drains back into the pan. Some of the feedback diaphragms keep some of the oil in the upper portion of the engine instead of letting it drain back in a lot of areas. One of the things that I went to on the Honda Accords with the VTC actuator failures in the timing chain, timing phaser failures on that rattle on startup, like the 2.4 liter, 2.5, what is it, a 2.4 liter Honda Accord, is I switched over to a name brand high quality filter that had an anti-feedback diaphragm in it. So I went with a actual Honda branded oil filter and started using good quality full synthetic oil and just changed out the VTC solenoid only. Never had that problem again and never rattled again. Quit completely. So my mom and my dad, both of them, I did both jobs on their vehicles, never rattled again. I didn't have to go get the phasers and all that other stuff updated. I went to high quality stuff and I made sure that I used what the manufacturer recommended. And they weren't going 5,000 miles on their oil changes. I changed their oil every 2,500, every 3,000 miles. I used the same old oil interval. And if you go back, way back in the day in the 50s, it was like every 60 days they recommended people change their oil. Oil's come a long way, right? It's synthesized a lot better now. It's refined a lot better now. The process alone is a lot better now. But a synthetic oil is a better oil. Now, people say that, I have an old engine with a lot of miles and stuff on it, and I'm afraid that if I put synthetic oil in my vehicle, that I might start experiencing a little bit more oil loss or oil leaks than what I do right now. You might. Synthetic oils have better detergent in it, better cleaning additive in it, and it may clean off some junk around the seals and stuff like that are helping seal some of those areas up that are already leaking. So a lot of people try to blame it on the oil that it's making it worse. Well, it is, but in a good way, because it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. Now, high mileage oils, 75,000 mile plus, like Valvoline oils, Max Life oils. Those oils have extra additives in there to help condition those seals and stuff that are in the motor. Can you use those oils from day one? You sure can. Nothing wrong with that. Probably a little bit better protected in that aspect, because you're conditioning and you're trying to keep those seals up to par. You're going to pay more for it, though. You pay more for the options to keep those seals in better condition than what they are. Let me go back to my questions real quick and then make sure I didn't miss anything here. I don't like the interval 5,000. I like a 3,000 mile interval oil change. I like a good quality filter. I like a full synthetic oil. And if I have the opportunity and I'm not doing anything and it's not a waste of money to change your oil early, I will change it at 2,500 miles. I'll change it at 2,200 miles. Because I want this motor to last. I don't care about how long people think that they should have their interval, or how long they should do this, or how long I don't care about that. I want my stuff in good condition, and the newer that I can keep that oil, the better off I'm going to be. The fresher I can keep that oil, the better off I'm going to be. That's where my mindset is in this. Now, a bunch of people asked me some questions. Let me pop out of this real quick and then come back and make sure I have those questions. Okay, so I bumped over and I looked at the questions real quick just to make sure I touched everything, and I pretty much did. I rambled a lot, but not rambled, but I kind of went a little bit more in depth than what most people will stay for the whole video for. If you've stayed for the whole video, let me know you stayed for the whole video. I appreciate it. I really do. Thank you for watching my content. I think it's very important to get this stuff out there. It was just mainly semi-synthetic versus full synthetic. Full synthetic is better, and you can run it from the beginning. Using cheap oils, lower grade oils, $3, $4 a quart oils are probably what's contributing to a lot of the noise. What's contributing to a lot of the timing chain phaser failure? Sure, That stuff does contribute. I would go to a full synthetic oil. Semi-synthetic is fine too. But if you don't have any oil leaks, you don't have any kind of like real serious issues or anything like that, you're just looking for better fuel economy, better life out of that motor, a full synthetic oil is going to get you there. It will. If you're already using conventional oil and you got a motor with a lot of miles and it's leaking, I would tread lightly on going to a full synthetic oil, because you may end up with a little bit more leaks than what you expect. Yeah, the vehicle is going to run better, but it's going to leak a little bit more probably because it has better cleaning ability to it. You see, back in the day, there were some issues with the content that was being pumped through the exhaust. There were manufacturers that were adding extra zinc content, extra nickel content to the motor oil. And with phosphorus being attached to that nickel content molecule, they had to reduce a lot of the nickel content to reduce the phosphorus stuff, because that's what was messing with the catalytic converters and stuff back then. And that's why now we have less nickel content than what we did, but that nickel content really did give a really nice film of protection across metal moving parts. Remember, the tighter the tolerances are on your main bearings and your rod bearings and stuff, your rod journals, the better load carrying capacity it has. The looser things are, the more a rotating assembly is going to make contact with specific spots and not have as even load carrying capability across that whole entire surface. So things could potentially wear out faster in a looser engine. That's why a lot of race car guys are changing parts often. They beat the hell out of them. They change their oil often. There's a lot of blow-by, a lot of stuff that gets in there, a lot of combustion gases that get down in that oil and stuff, where conventional oil can't fight that stuff as much. So a full synthetic has better chemical compounds to it, and it can actually fight that combustion blow-by process, in which that contamination gets down in the oil, and it keeps it suspended and dispersed. So when you drain the oil, it all rushes out. It's where like more of a conventional oil, it still has that, but it's at a lighter venue, and more of that stuff can stay in the engine and congregate in specific areas, especially if you're going to that 5,000 mile oil change and you're in a lot of stop and go traffic all the time. It's better to change your oil sooner, and use a really good quality oil and a nice decent filter, not some cheap $3 Purolator from Farm and Fleet. You know, it is what it is. So yeah, I've answered all the questions. Full synthetic is better. Semi-synthetic is your next best bet, and then conventional is also good, but it doesn't have the same cleaning capability and protection that the additives do in the other two. Full synthetic being the best, that I do recommend running from day one. Higher mileage motor, when somebody recommends you run 20W50 just based on miles, that's ridiculous. That should never apply. Just based on miles. What you do is you run the manufacturer's oil recommended in that vehicle, and you continue keeping it clean, changing it. If you can afford to change it at 3,000 miles, I would. I'd change it sooner than 5,000 for sure. I wouldn't let it go 5,000 miles, and I would continue doing what you're doing because it's working. When somebody typically throws a oil amount out there and says, you know, or an oil viscosity out there based on mileage, I think it's a foolish thing. You need to know more about what's going on with that engine before you start playing with those numbers. And remember, on cold starts, your 5W20 is now acting like a 20 weight, and it takes longer to get to moving components, which is going to cause it to wear out faster before the engine actually starts moving and getting up to operating temperature to be able to get through that 20 weight into the 50 weight, which it's not designed for. So just keep that in mind. Thank you. There will be a part 2. This is on the history of oil companies.